The bottom line is we are taking in tremendous amounts of money. It already started as of last Friday, but it really started 7 months before that. It's in the form of tariffs or taxes, and it had a tremendous impact. So we're in a very good position, and I think it's only going to get better.
Welcome back to Harvard. That was President Trump, of course, in the Oval Office today, saying he isn't backing down on his escalating trade war with China. After Trump raised tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods last week, China fired back with $60 billion worth of tariffs on American goods. For President Trump, who can boast about a much improved U.S. economy, this promised battle has the potential to cause some economic pain everywhere. In the last 5 trading days, for example, the Dow Jones average has dropped almost 1,000 points, costing stockholders the reality of about a 4% loss of their wealth. It's 4%, it's a lot. Since Friday, the president has tweeted and retweeted more than 24 times about the economy and the ongoing trade war. And while the president continues to inaccurately or incorrectly say it is China who's paying for tariffs, his own economic advisor, Lawrence Kudlow, is saying it's Americans who are going to suffer.
In fact, both sides will pay. Both sides will pay in these things. And, of course, it depends.
If it's a tariff on goods coming into the country, the Chinese aren't paying.
No, but the Chinese will suffer GDP losses and so forth.
They may suffer consequences, but it's U.S. businesses and U.S. consumers who pay, correct?
Yes, to some extent. Yeah, I don't disagree with that.
I don't disagree with that because it's true. For more, I'm joined by John Brabender, a Republican strategist, and Joel Payne, a Democratic strategist. Let's talk the politics of this. In all fairness, I think Donald Trump, although he's in many ways a wealthy guy and a Republican, I guess. You think he is now? He's also running against trade. And that has been a position a lot of people I grew up with in Pennsylvania were against. They thought trade was negative. They didn't like the Kennedy round. They didn't like all this free trade talk. It hurts the working. It killed industry in states like Pennsylvania. And so people like Sherrod Brown of Ohio and Bobby Casey and Marcia Kaplan, there's a lot of Democrats who are very much against what's been called free trade. Trump comes along and said, I'm going to do something about it. Everybody knows, Joel, it's going to hurt. If you get into a trade war with a country that makes stuff really well, I mean, the cotton undershirts, dress shirts, everything we buy is cotton, is 100% cotton, and everybody likes it. And it comes from China, it doesn't kill us. So it's very hard to fight with them.
Yeah, and look,
we want their stuff.
And I think the president, look, even as a Democrat, has made a smart play on trade. But he's like a bull in a china shop. What he's not taking into account is the collateral damage that he's causing to the economy. You mentioned the 4% that's been impacted by the stock market. What about all the people who are going to be impacted by all these goods going up in cost? And also to not be honest about it. It's the same thing as saying Mexico is going to pay for the wall.
What would a good Democrat do? You're a Democratic strategist. What would a good Democrat do on trade? Because we've been stuck with this situation for years with China.
I think there are places to agree with the president on trade. I think someone like Sherrod Brown has been smart about finding those places to agree. And I wouldn't talk down the economy, but what I would not do is line up behind Donald Trump in terms of tone and in terms of being the type of economic statesman that we're expecting in the Oval Office.
Well said.
Yeah, but here's what people understand. This is Donald Trump. In fact, I would argue China might be the biggest reason that he ran. What he's doing is saying, look, there's one thing worse than getting a no deal, and that's getting a really bad deal. Most politicians will go, they'll have these meetings, and if they walk away with no deal, they say we failed. That's not how Trump looks at it. Second of all, Trump believes in the case of China right now, we're negotiating from strength. Their economy is nowhere near as strong as our economy, and he's willing to go there and up.
Real simply, what do we sell to China? I know what we buy from cotton goods, shirts, everything like pants, khaki pants and everything. What do we sell them?
Well, we sell them soybeans, and right now they're down 90% because of this whole tariff deal. And what's interesting, though, is the farmers and people in the Rust Belt are still staying with this president, understanding that we need to have a long-term deal, not short-term. And so,
of course they are, because of his strategy, right? It's a base strategy. So there's not a strategy that's built on going after moderates or going after independents. He doesn't care about that. He's created this culture war where he's got 35 to 40% of the people that are going to always be with him.
What are these people trading? They're giving up economic pain. They're accepting it. Higher prices.
Well, they want to be a part of the gang. They want to be a part of the Trump gang or the Trump club.
That's
what they're trading.
They're trading. I'm not talking about regular voters.
Yeah, that's what I'm talking about, too. These people want to be associated. They want to be associated with Donald Trump.
Well, President Trump's confrontational approach to China should come as no surprise as he campaigned heavily on the issue, as you said, Joel, in 2016. Let's watch.
We're going to stand up to China on trade. China, which has been ripping us off the greatest abuser in the history of this country. We can't continue to allow China to rape our country, and that's what they're doing. It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
Then they say we're going to lose a trade war? We're already losing the trade war, folks.
We're losing $500 billion in trade with China. Who the hell cares if there's a trade war? We are in a competition with the world, and I want America to win.
When it comes to the president's supporters on issues like this, Wall Street Journal columnist Peggy Noonan writes, I liked her column this week, I have never talked to a Trump supporter who thought Trump had a high personal character. On the other hand, they sincerely believe he has a high political character in that he pursues the issues he campaigned on. They hired him as an insult to the political class, as a Hail Mary pass. We've tried everything else. Maybe this will work. And because we agree with him on the issues, John.
Well, she's right. And here's what I don't understand is the left keeps saying, well, he's just playing to his base and they're just responding. Well, his base are Democrats in places like Pittsburgh, Detroit, Youngstown, Ohio. I don't understand why the left is constantly criticizing the base they wish that they had. This is on this particular issue. They think we've been getting sand kicked in our face all over the world for decades, and they're pretty happy when they see this.
Now they're being lied to by a president who's saying that they are not going to shoulder the burden of his food fight with
They
China.
see somebody standing up and representing them and giving them a megaphone for the first time in a long time, and they like it, quite frankly.
Well, my problem with the Chinese, and I think they're good at it, they have long-term plans. They had like 2 bad centuries after the last 20 or 30 centuries, 19th and 20th. They're going to win this century. And the Chinese want to win it by having a great trade advantage with us, and they get all that cash they get from us, and they go buy all the land in Africa.
Can I just say
That's
something
what
about
they
the
do.
economy real quick?
No, I want to say that point.
Yeah.
China wins. They beat us on trade. They take the money and they go around buying up resources all around the world forever.
And there's a part of that Trump plays into, which is we're not going to get kicked around again, which is smart political theater. But the point I want to make here is about, I think there's this thought that Donald Trump has, how can he lose with this economy? I think you should turn it around the other way and say, how is he not winning by more? How is he only at 45 or 46% with one of the greatest economies we've ever seen?
Because of what Peggy Noonan just wrote,
Exactly.
his personal character.
But at least I appreciate you saying that Donald Trump has created one of the greatest economies of all time, because there's truth to that.
Well,
I don't think I said that.
Well, I'm not sure the jobs
Thanks,
are all.
Obama.
I'm not sure the jobs are all great, but I was taught in school, in grad school. I was working for a PhD actually at one point. You couldn't get 3.6% unemployment. You couldn't get that low. So something's going. Pennsylvania, by the latest numbers, incredible numbers in Pennsylvania on the economy. Thank you, John Brabender and Joel Payne. Good competition here. A quick reminder, don't miss Hardball's special live event, The Deciders. We're heading to Pennsylvania to find out what issues are important to people up there and why they vote the way they do. It's Thursday night at 7 Eastern, right here on MSNBC.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.